Hey guys, in this video we're going to talk about variables and declaration. Now, there's three possible keywords to define a variable. So we have var, which has been around since the beginning of JavaScript. We also have let, and we have const, which were introduced in ES 2015, also called ES6, which was an update to the JavaScript language that included many new features. Now, since this is a modern JavaScript course, let and const are now fully supported in the browser. We're going to stay away from var after this video. Okay, let and const have a big advantage when it comes to block level scope, but I'm not going to go over that in this video. We're going to wait till the end of the section because there's no sense in talking about scope and functions and blocks when I haven't even talked about functions and blocks yet. So I'm going to give you some examples of all three and kind of explain the differences between them. And then, like I said, later on in another video, we'll talk about block level scope and how that works. All right, so let's quickly go over how to actually create a variable, which is very simple. For this example, I'm going to use var, but like I said, we'll use const and let after this. All right, so let's go ahead and declare a variable with var. So we'll say var name equals, we're going to set it to a string called John Doe. And I'm going to go over data types in JavaScript in the next video. All right, and strings can be double quotes or single quotes. So that's all there is to actually declaring a variable. So we can do what we want with this. We can go ahead and console log it. So we'll say console log name and save. It runs, and you can see we get John Doe down here in the console. Now we can take this variable and we can reassign it. Okay, we can do that with var and with let. Const is a different story, and I'll talk about that in a few minutes. But if we wanted to, we could say name equals, and let's say Steve Smith. And then if we were to console.log name here, you'll see we get John Doe for this log, and then we change it, and then we get Steve Smith. So you can reassign variables if you use var or let. Okay. Now, you can also assign or create variables and not assign them to a value. So I could say, let's say init a variable. So this is called initializing it. So we'll say var greeting and not set it equal to anything. All right, now this is actually setting it to undefined. So if I were to console.log greeting and save, we're going to get undefined. Okay, but we can take this variable and we can assign it to something now by just saying greeting, and we'll just set it to hello. All right, so if I go ahead and console.log it here, we get hello. Now, a lot of times you'll do this, you'll initialize it without a value if you need to, if you have a conditional. So let's say we have an if statement, which we'll talk about in a little bit, and we want to say if something is true, greeting equals this, if something or else, greeting equals this. So that's one of the reasons we initialize variables. All right, now before we get into let and const, I just want to talk about rules and conventions of variables in JavaScript. Now, there's only a couple different things that a variable can include. It can include letters, numbers, an underscore, and a money sign. Okay, so these are the only characters that can be inside of a variable. They also cannot start with a number. Okay, so if we were to try and create a variable called one name, you'll see that it's already throwing an error inside the editor here. And if I were to save that, we'll get an error in the console saying invalid unexpected token. We'll get a syntax error. Okay, this is not allowed. You can use a money sign at the beginning or anywhere, but that's not really recommended. The only time that I would suggest using this is if you are using jQuery and you were selecting things from the DOM with jQuery, which globally uses a money sign itself. So if you're setting a variable to a jQuery object, then you might want to use that. You could also do an underscore. That's okay. That's not going to throw an error. But again, I wouldn't suggest it. When you start getting into more advanced JavaScript patterns and you can have private variables, that's where you might see this. This is kind of global for private variables and that goes for like frameworks and stuff like that as well. But usually you just want to start it with a letter. All right, now let's talk about conventions for more than one word. So multi-word variables. Let's say we want a variable called first name. So what I would suggest is using this method, and this is called camel case. And this doesn't just pertain to JavaScript. This is programming in general. This I think is the most readable. You might also see something like this. You see this more in languages like PHP. Let's set this to Sarah. So this is just under the underscore method or underscore convention. You might also see this. Okay, so this is Pascal case, which is the same as camel case, except it starts with an uppercase as well. All right, and then sometimes you may see double multi-words all lowercase, which I wouldn't recommend. This is what I would suggest. This is the convention we're going to use throughout the course. All right, now this here, starting it with an uppercase, this is recommended in some situations. For instance, when we get into object-oriented programming, when you create a constructor function, that should start with an uppercase. When you create a class with ES6 classes, that should be uppercase. Okay, so there are certain times when this convention is recommended. But just for regular variables, then I would suggest this, and that's what we're going to use. All right, so now that we've talked about the basics of variables, let's now talk about let and const. So let works very similar to var. In fact, it seems identical on it is identical on the global scope. But you have advantages when it comes to block level scoping, which again we'll talk about later. But if I were to take, let's say, this block of code right here that we wrote and do the same thing with let. So I'm going to paste that in, and then I'm going to comment everything up here out. Now in VS Code we can highlight everything and do Control / and that will comment out everything. So what I'm going to do is just change this to let and save, and you'll see it works the same exact way. We can initialize, we can create a variable, and then we can change it. We can reassign it. We can also initialize it as undefined, so we can go let name just like that, and that will still work as well. Now const works differently, so I'm going to just go ahead and comment that out. So const actually stands for constant, and what that means is that it can't change, okay, or it can't be reassigned. So if I say const name equals John, and we console.log name, that's fine. Okay, we get John, everything's okay. But what we can't do is reassign. Okay, so if I say name equals Sarah and save, we cannot do that. You'll see we get an error. It says assignment to constant variable. So that does not work. So I'm going to comment that out. Another thing we can't do, or we have to do, is we have to assign a value. So we have to assign a value. We can't do const greeting and not assign it to anything. If I save that, we're going to get an error that says missing initializer in const declaration. It has to be declared as some kind of value. Now, where some people get confused that are just starting out is when we use const with arrays and objects and other types of data that aren't primitive, like strings and numbers, things that can change but not be reassigned. So for instance, if I were to say const person, and I know we haven't talked about objects yet, but this is actually really important, so I'm still gonna mention it. So if we were to set name to John here, and we go down and console.log our object, okay, that's called an object literal, you'll see we get, let me just comment this part out, we get our object with name John, okay? And objects can have more than one key value pair, so we could say like age 30, and we can put whatever we want in here. Now where people get confused is that we can take that person variable, that person object, and we can mutate it. We can change the name, for example, and save, and you can see that now name is Sarah. So we can change the stuff that's in here. We just can't reassign person. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. Even though we changed the data inside the object, it's still set to that object. All right, and I could change the age if I wanted to by saying person age equals, and we'll say 32, and save, and you can see now age 32. All right, so same thing with arrays. If I were to create an array called numbers and just put some numbers in here, and then go down here and log it, you'll see it'll log the array. Now I can add on to this by saying numbers.push, which is a method we can use to add on to an array. So I'm going to add on 6 and save, and now you can see that array has 6 in it. All right, so we can change arrays and objects that are assigned to variables using const. We just can't redeclare and say numbers equals and then set it to a brand new array with 6 in it like that. If I do that, we're going to get an error because this is a whole new array. Okay, it's a whole new entity. We're not just mutating it like we are here. All right, so that's where some people get confused with const. They think that whatever you assign it to, it has to stay this, but it doesn't if it's an array, an object, or another reference type. Now this is where you make a decision as a developer on how you want to declare your variables. Now it's all preference, but what I would recommend and what I do and what I'm going to do in this course is I'm going to use const unless I plan on the value changing, unless I need to initialize it, or unless I'm using it in an iterator or a loop. Other than that, using const lets your program and anyone looking at your code know that this value should not be reassigned. All right, it can mutate if it's an array or an object, but it can't be reassigned as a new primitive value. And I think that makes your code more robust, more secure, and it makes it more readable. Okay, it lets you know that this value needs to stay this value. All right, so I know that this may have been a little confusing for people that have never worked with arrays and objects, but I did want to just mention that because I think it's important to know. But in the next video, we're going to start to talk about data types in JavaScript, both primitive types and reference types.